Dear guests, welcome to one of the first Northeast Ohio and hopefully annual TEDx Youth at University School event in the last 5 years. This is a culmination of many months of work to provide students an opportunity to express their thoughts and ideas related to the world around them. I'd like to thank the TEDx organization for allowing me the license to hold this event and University School for extending their wonderful facilities as host. I'd like to thank the head of school, Mr. Gallagher, and head of upper school, Dr. Daughtry, for their continued support in allowing and encouraging the men of University School to expand their horizons and build the foundation for future learning, both at US and surrounding communities. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Dr. Folds, for his guidance and tenacity in providing the mentorship to myself and my team. I would also like to give a special thanks to Ms. Kennedy and the marketing department for printing these wonderful pamphlets that we have created. Finally, I'd like to thank the U.S. Parent Association for providing funds, as well as my team, Bradley Wyant and Ryan Stream, and teacher chaperones that worked through the many details required to hold this TEDx. This lays the groundwork for future student leaders to develop their ideas and ideals in supportive and inclusive platform. TEDx Youth at University School was an idea that I first was exposed to at my previous school, Maumee Valley Country Day School in Toledo, Ohio. I was fortunate to have an older brother in high school at the time that dragged me to the event. Little did I know that several years later I would venture into the unknown and broach the subject with university school administrators with the idea of bringing this formative platform to the area. My idea and tag name for the event, Hindsight is 2020, is both a play on words and an opportunity for us to reflect on how the past several years have impacted and observe how it has changed us and how it will change the future. I could have never imagined coming in as a freshman that at the end of the year, how different, scary, and confusing it would become. My track season canceled, wearing masks, canceled classes, remote learning, the list goes on. I challenge my peers, the schools, and local community to use this experience to continue and foster our voices for years to come. Before we start with the speakers, I would like to thank them separately for having the courage and the embodiment of today's youth as charismatic, thoughtful, and inclusive future leaders. It was a difficult decision to pick the 10 speakers out of dozens of the applicants that shared their ideas with us, and as individuals, to stand in front of this audience today and share their stories. To say that I'm amazed would be an understatement. It's one thing to organize the event, but quite another to summon the courage and fortitude to formulate one's thoughts and present them to a peer audience. Each one in their own way bring together thoughtful expression to share and to reflect on. Congratulations to all in advance. Just an additional note, the event is being live streamed as well in addition to being available on the YouTube channel HV Assembly. Please roll the clip.
Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a nonprofit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
To start us off is Sophia Barris from Shaker Heights High School to talk to you about confidence in COVID.
Confidence in COVID, how a global pandemic gave me my worth back. Take a look at this girl. What are some traits that comes to mind? Now, what about this girl? Are these the same traits? Maybe something different? Well, physically, these two are me, the person standing in front of you. They are two completely different people taken over a year apart from me. And the second one is about to endure a 22-month journey of self-realization and discovery. Started with a couple electric razor swipes in a high school auditorium, followed by a global pandemic. Now, I want you to look at this person. This was taken on my 15th birthday during a trip to the zoo. I had just transferred to a public high school in the middle of a school year. Looking at this person, I see the fear in my eyes. I see what was coming, but at the time I didn't really know. This girl was afraid. This girl didn't have any friends at her new school. She was struggling with her schedule. She got lost on her first day and cried because she couldn't find her classroom. This girl was afraid. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know. And looking at this girl, she had social anxiety. She didn't know that she had social anxiety, but she did. And she cared so deeply about what other people thought of her. She cared about her social media following. She cared about what she posted. She cared about how she interacted with others. She gave absolutely no thought to herself. She gave no thought to her self-worth and her self-care. And as 2018 and 2019 progressed and I moved into the summer, my problems got worse. I felt even more unsure of myself. I felt even more ostracized. I didn't know what to do with myself. I thought everyone hated me. And she had a mask on. I knew that something needed to change. I knew that she needed something that she wasn't getting. She needed change. In December 2019, I received an email. My high school sent out daily announcements, and there was an announcement for a charity called St. Baldrick's. I'd heard of it, but I thought I could never shave my head on a stage. I thought I could never do that, because what would people think of me? A girl with no hair? How could people respond to that? But that little girl, in June of 2019, she realized that she needed change, so she signed up. She signed up and set a goal for $1,000, which seems like a lot of money. And it was about to get even harder. No one encouraged her to shave her head. She did it all on her own. People thought, you can't do it. You can't. You're going to look weird. You're going to be embarrassed. People are going to talk about you behind your back. But she said, I don't care. I'm doing this. She said, I'd rather have hair than have a child die of cancer, which in retrospect was a very selfless thought. So she did it. She took that anger and she fearlessly fundraised over $1,300. And she did it. On January 31st, 2020, she shaved her head in front of about 400 people in her high school's auditorium, very similar to this one. She did it. But she was still afraid. The people that didn't encourage her weren't nice to her about shaving her head. They called her bald girl. They said that you look weird with a shaved head. You need to change your face a little bit, maybe even out your eyebrows. This photo was taken about 2 weeks after I shaved my head. I was in a conference with my friends. A lot of people started referring to me as the bald girl. I was bald, that's a very good point. But I thought, why am I being referred to for my hair? Why is nobody looking at who I am? Why did nobody ask me why I did it? They saw the hair, they thought something. People weren't nice about it, but I knew that I had friends. And this was about a month before COVID. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know what was coming for me. When COVID hit, I was afraid. But I took isolation and I relished it. I needed to work on myself. I didn't know that, but I needed to. I spiraled. I was depressed. I didn't come out of my room for days. I was afraid posting on social media, posting on Snapchat. I didn't know what people were going to think. But I had a moment. I have this set of gel markers that you can use to write on windows with. And I used to draw on my windows. I used to do it as a fun thing. But I decided to do something. I took my mirror, I took my full-length dresser mirror, and wrote some stuff on it. I wrote things that I like about myself. I wrote kind, I wrote effervescent, I wrote daring, I wrote courageous, I wrote human. But one that stuck with me was growing. I was growing. I didn't know how much that word would mean to me. I was growing mentally. I was growing physically. I was growing. I told myself that I needed the summer. I didn't work. I didn't do anything. I needed to grow. I needed to work on myself. And by August, I had a really good-looking mullet. But I didn't feel any better about myself. I still thought to myself, I'm worthless. I don't know what to do. I was growing physically, but I didn't grow mentally. So I started filling that void by dyeing my hair. I went with pink, I went with blue, I went with red, I went with green. Didn't help that much. I still was socially anxious. I still didn't like who I was looking in the mirror. I still didn't feel confident. And that's the part that got me the most. But as the world returned to normalcy, I had a realization. I seemed to forget that I was growing. I seemed to forget that I was changing. I seemed to forget that I was trying and that I was human. And that it was okay to make mistakes. But the thing that made me realize that was my hair. My hair was growing. It was long, it was pretty, it was full. But it was a physical marker of all the stuff that I went through. I had seemed to forget this. I forgot that I shaved my head and stripped myself of all my confidence and who I was before January 31st, 2020. This was the physical rebirth of my confidence caught on camera. This was the moment that I changed. It was pre-shave, pre-COVID, post-shave, pre-COVID, and then post-shave, post-COVID. After I realized this, I got to go on a trip to Israel. It was a summer, it was a month. But I finally felt good enough about myself. I finally felt like I could be someone that I actually knew. And because of this, I made some of the best memories and some of the best friends in the world. I can't say it was because of Israel, but I can say that I had changed and that change was benefiting me. And I ended up having an amazing summer. First at my job, then in Israel, and then back at my job. Well, these pictures are 3 different versions of me. It's still me. I still went through the journey, and I'm still growing. I am still working on my confidence. I'm still human. But if I didn't shave my head on January 31st, 2020, I'd still be searching for that confidence that I so looked for. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Frances Connors from Hawken High School to give her speech, "The Ocean is Our Oyster." Now we have Chase Sloan from Hawken High School to give his speech, Lifting Weights, Spirits, and Confidence. Thank you.
Imagine this. You spent the first 13 years of your life in a body that definitely wasn't yours. Now you're 15, you've been able to get some help and make some changes so that your inner and outer selves can align more, yet your body still doesn't feel quite right to you. In fact, your whole presence doesn't feel quite right to you. You're anxious, you're awkward, you lack confidence, and you know it. Long story, still sort of long. The thing that causes you the most stress in life is you. Anyhow, it's tough, but living in a normal, or I guess now you would call it a pre-pandemic normal world, keeps your mental health at bay. There's enough distractions, enough to focus on and interact with besides yourself, so you don't need to look inward too much and deal with all that's going on in there. Yet, as Eminem has said, a normal life is boring. Or, in this case, that normal pre-pandemic life ceased to exist in late March of 2020. After that, no more going out, no more seeing friends and family, no more of those simple day-to-day interactions that you took for granted. You're stuck at home, everybody else is too, and you begin to have to spend a lot of time with the man or woman or just human in the mirror. Anyhow, if you get where I'm going with this, this is pretty much exactly the situation I found myself in during lockdown. That all said, amongst all the things that I was thinking at the time, one thing I knew was that I had to do something about the way I felt about myself. At first I felt sort of trapped and didn't know what to do. Yet, as 1 week at home turned into 2 weeks, and 2 weeks began to look like at least a couple months of being isolated, I realized the answer was right in front of me and dove in. Even before the pandemic, I was very much into working out, having started at the start of freshman year. I was determined to get bigger and stronger and was doing what I thought necessary to get there. I was pretty dedicated, yet really ignorant, if I'm being honest. I put myself on whatever free programs from muscleandstrength.com sounded effective, was constantly adding weight to exercise without considering form whatsoever, and was eating about as much protein as my poor toilet could handle. Though my approach wasn't ideal, and my results were definitely suboptimal, I was still able to build a lot of discipline and consistency that I was able to apply elsewhere and feel good about. This pushed me to keep going. My sessions in the gym became an escape from reality. Once I began to have more time at home from being in the pandemic, I ended up giving even more of myself to bodybuilding. I started doing more research, paying at least some attention to my execution of exercises, switching up my diet, and even taking progress photos, though I was still ashamed of how I looked. Soon enough, bodybuilding evolved into more than a hobby for me, both physically and emotionally. My sessions in the basement gym became my escape from reality. In the gym, it was just me and the weights, but being alone with myself was okay, as while lifting weights, I felt focused mentally, strong physically, and nothing else seemed to matter besides getting the weight up. Starting my day with a workout still felt, even if it wasn't the best workout ever, still felt infinitely better than not, as I was doing something that was good for me, and I could feel myself getting better from it. Even basic daily activities like eating and sleeping were given a hefty boost of purpose and importance, as I knew that how I recovered and how I feel myself would make all the difference in me getting my goals or not. What's more, I managed to meet a lot of great people through Instagram bodybuilding communities that pushed me to keep going and gave me encouragement. I had people I didn't even know cheering me on, yet more importantly, I had a few set things in life that I could control. This meant the world to me in a time of much uncertainty, and also forced me to develop a lot of accountability and self-respect, as I knew it was on me and me alone to do what needed to be done for progress. While I can't say I went from zero to hero and my mental health is completely fixed, it got a lot better, and I was opening up avenues to improve it even more. Even in the winter of 2020 to 2021, when I experienced a complete halt in progress, it wasn't the end of the world, as it's what led me to my coach, Ashton. His genuine advice, science-based training strategies, and reassurance that carbs were not my mortal enemy, as the internet might suggest, allowed me to feel more free and make more progress from the hard work I was doing than ever before. Fast forward to now, not only do I look and feel better in my own skin, but I have the satisfaction of knowing it's due to something I did, a product of my own hard work, and that adds a whole nother level of accomplishment. When it comes to using bodybuilding as a catalyst for self and mental health improvement, it turns out I'm really not alone either. There are thousands of people, a few of whom I've met, whether online or in person, who have done the same. And the amount of science that backs exercise as a natural antidepressant and anxiolytic is pretty incredible. Beyond just the mood boost and satisfaction from getting results from self-improvement work like exercise, there are numerous biological mechanisms as well as psychological theories that tell us the process of exercising and or improving oneself can aid our mental health. On the physical side of things, exercise increases the presence of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and endorphins. It increases mitochondrial biogenesis. It activates the mammalian target of rapamycin, or mTOR, influences the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and reduces inflammation. Psychologically, there are two specific hypotheses, the distraction hypothesis and the self-efficacy and mastery hypothesis, that further explain the correlation between exercise and better mental health. To refresh some memories, a neurotransmitter is a type of ligand, or chemical signaling molecule used between neurons, or the cells that make up our brains and the rest of our nervous system. Neurons release neurotransmitters to stimulate neurons nearby, pass electrical impulses through the body, and cause the body to respond in some way. There are over 100 types of neurotransmitters out there, but 4 of them have been specifically correlated to both exercise and mental health. So let's dive into those a little more. Serotonin is defined by hormones.org as our feel-good hormone. It is responsible for feelings of happiness and optimism, and low levels can lead to depression. In fact, the function of the most commonly prescribed antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, is to block neurons that secrete serotonin from reabsorbing it, therefore increasing the amount of serotonin that's available for use of other neurons. Exercise can work similarly to SSRIs. In a study by Dr. Brad Whitley and colleagues, published in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sports, exercise was shown to reduce serotonin reuptake levels as well as serotonin levels in the blood, therefore increasing the amount of serotonin available for use by neurons to transmit messages. Dopamine is our neurotransmitter that aids with pleasure and focus. It is made in the midbrain area, specifically the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area, and released when people or animals expect to receive a reward. Therefore, it is correlated to feelings of positivity and accomplishment, as well as reinforcing behaviors that lead to rewards. Furthermore, in a study by Dr. Gregory Ashby and colleagues, increased dopamine levels were found to improve performance on cognitive tasks such as learning and memory. In sum, more dopamine is good in more ways than one. Exercise in itself can stimulate the release of dopamine, but there are also numerous activities related to exercise that can also factor in dopamine increases. One example is from is a suggestion from psychologist Loretta Graziano-Bruning in her book, Habits of a Happy Brain, which is to begin celebrating small victories. Bruning says that to celebrate these small wins is to linger on your gains the way you already linger on your losses. Working out is one of the specific activities he suggests to enable this, which makes sense, as working out is quite literally making gains to linger on. And furthermore, exercise is a great thing to implement into your daily routine. Making it a habit essentially guarantees you a way to win daily. Norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, is a neurotransmitter primarily known for its links to heart rate and blood flow, but it can also aid in energy and focus. It is made from the adrenal gland. It comes from the adrenal glands and is part of the same family of neurotransmitters as serotonin and dopamine. Low levels of norepinephrine or noradrenaline can lead to a number of issues such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, lethargy, lack of concentration, and substance abuse. Yet, in many of these different cases, exercise was proven to help reduce these issues by increasing the availability of norepinephrine to neurons, such in ways similar to how SSRIs help neurons access serotonin. Endorphins, our final neurotransmitter to focus are the endorphins. There are over 20 types of neurotransmitters in this family, and their role is to act as natural painkillers. They're made in the hypothalamus and pituitary glands of the brain, and they get their name from what they do. The name endorphins comes from the words endogenous morphine, with endogenous meaning made inside the body, and morphine being like the opiate painkiller. Endorphins have long been connected to exercise and mental health boosts due to numerous studies, as well as the prevalence of the well-known sensation known as runner's high. Recently, there has been some debate as to whether endorphins are fully responsible for the mood boosts following exercise, like runner's high, and studies in mice have found that endocannabinoids may play the role, but nonetheless, the principle remains the same. Exercise leads to the secretion of neurotransmitters and other chemicals that boost our mood. Though generally less popular than the neurotransmitters, exercise can also by increasing mitochondrial biogenesis, activating myosin, influencing the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and mitochondrial biogenesis is the body's production of more mitochondria. Cells. This aids in neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, or the brain's ability to adapt to new stimuli and produce more neurons. Exercise can increase mitochondrial biogenesis, and therefore neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, therefore making us more adaptable to stress, triggers, and unfamiliar stimuli. Another way exercise can aid us is by activating the mammalian target of rapamycin, or mTOR. mTOR is an enzyme that aids in growth, development, aging, learning, memory, and more. Its activation from exercise can help improve all these processes, as well as act as yet another type of antidepressant. In contrast to its activation of mTOR, exercise can dampen the response of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA for short, is the interaction between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland in the brain and the adrenal glands, and is responsible for the body's response to stress and releasing stress hormones such as cortisol. Therefore, a hyperactivity of it can lead to poor stress management, increased susceptibility to stress, and further lead to depression and anxiety. In situations where this was the case with patients, incorporating exercise regimens was shown to help reduce these issues by dampening the HPA axis. The final notable way in which exercise aids us via biological mechanisms is by both directly and indirectly affecting the release of cytokines, or immune signaling molecules. This can reduce chronic inflammation, a hyperactivity of the immune system, and well-known condition proven to cause many different symptoms, both mental and physical. Aside from the ways the neurotransmitters I mentioned affect cognition, there are other ways in which exercise can aid us psychologically. The distraction hypothesis states that exercise, among other activities, can act as a sort of mental timeout or a distraction from negative and worrying thoughts. This hypothesis has been around for over 40 years and used in numerous studies since, largely one by Michael Barkey and colleagues, in which exercise was used along with meditation and just resting as a form of mental timeout for patients. In the study, exercise was able to cause significant reductions for majority of patients in stress, anxiety, and depression. The self-efficacy and mastery hypothesis states that working on a task and putting effort into it can increase your feelings of capability and therefore your self-perception. The correlation between exercising and self-efficacy and mental health has been well established in numerous studies of both healthy individuals and patients with serious underlying conditions such as lung cancer. In other words, exercise can help anyone, no matter what stage in your physiological journey you're at. All right, to sum things up, exercise can be good, really good for you in more ways than one. It can increase levels of chemicals that make you happier, make you more adaptive and less prone to stress, distract you from negative and worrying thoughts, increase your self-perception, all while making you healthier physically. Yet, to add one more piece from my own personal experience, exercise can give you hope, and that makes all the difference on good days as well as bad. The mantra that working out has given me is, it gets better. What do those 3 words do for me, you may ask? Well, my mindset has been that when you are engaging in exercise or any sort of self-improvement, really, you are quite literally getting better. So you can keep your head up and look forward to when your life will have to follow that trend. As far as what you can do, I'm not suggesting that you go from 0 to 100 and begin training like you're Arnold. I'm not even suggesting that you go to a gym and follow a structured lifting program. All I'm suggesting to you is that you get moving, because when you get moving, so many other things in your life do too. Whether that means playing a team sport, CrossFit, martial arts, dancing, swimming, ice skating, bike riding, running, or even just walking around your house or climbing the stairs. Think about all the gifts that your effort can give you when you give to it. Remember, it gets better, but only when you make it. So give your best and become your best too. Thank you.
Nice. This is the correct slide. Next is Ella Morasco from Laurel to give her speech about who are you if not the person you've always been?
For the longest time, I could not be caught dead in anything repping Ohio pride. I did make some allowances in my later years for my avid love of the Cleveland Cavaliers, but for the majority of my youth, I just never got the point. Even though it's what my students or what my peers wore to school every single day, the 216 and the CLE. At first, I just blamed it on the fact that I wasn't from Cleveland. I was actually from Nashville and Chicago intermediately, but that's what I blamed it on. And, sorry guys. But I blamed it on not being from Cleveland. I blamed it on not being from Cleveland because that's where everybody else that I knew was from. And I blamed it on not being from Cleveland because I was from Nashville and I was actually from Chicago. And a big part of that also was that I was all over the place all the time. My parents were broke grad students when I was born, so we were moving around for different jobs and opportunities. And even when I was younger, my mom was scooping me up and taking me to every museum and park that she physically possibly could. And when you're 6, and even when you're an adult, going around Chicago can feel like world travel. But then I was 7 and we moved here to Cleveland. And what I didn't know then is that my dad and his new job and this new city would mean a whole new world of possibilities, and that world travel was actually about to begin. Without much care for my school's opinions, I was pulled out all the time. About twice a year, for slightly exorbitant amounts of time, I was traveling all over the place. I had a whole system, including color-coded folders for all of my work, and I can still tell you about writing, like learning how to write between the lines in Kansas hotels on the way to Colorado, and the basic chemistry lesson that I got outside of Dinosaur National Monument. I was learning all the time. I had a whole system of little blank books with pictures and notes, and I'd go sit on the little chair and show my teachers when I got back, and I loved every second of it. And this continued. This continued until 7th grade when I went intercontinental. I got to explore Switzerland and France, and then the next year I was in London and Graz and Bolzano and Italy and Vienna, and I was in love. I was in love with every second of it. I was in love with these cultures and these communities that were completely foreign to me that I could go and explore. I feel like every single second of the day when I was home, I was thinking about being somewhere else. I was thinking about how to get to high school and how to go to boarding school in Switzerland, which was a very legitimate conversation that occurred for me. I was thinking all the time about all these places that I could go and explore. And then 2020, as we all know, COVID hit. For the first time in my life, I spent more than 3 continuous months inside of my own home. I was shocked. For a long time, it was hard to process. And by May 2020, I was heartbroken, because I'd come to terms with the fact that this might be it, that I might not get to travel again for a long time. I even took to reading travel books on my insomnia-ridden nights, like planning my adventures for when I'd finally get out. And at some point, I digressed, and reading and art became an escape, which I will still argue to this day is actually an incredible way to continue to travel. And the reading helped, it really did, and I was reading 3 books a week, but don't give me too much credit, they were mostly audiobooks. But in my final year, or my final couple months of school, in May 2020, a book finally came available, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. For those of you who don't know, it's a book that follows the story of an Italian-American family, all the way from Italy to immigration and a couple generations back. So it follows the generation that came from Italy, and then all the way until the family in Connecticut of the author. And so the story is it's very difficult to read, and it follows this really difficult, complex ideas of family loyalty, what being an immigrant actually means, and it follows it's difficult. And thankfully, I did not actually see that many parallels to my own family, my immediate family, and some of the more difficult parts, but I really resonated with this message of Italian Americans and the Italian American story. My last name is Marasco. My family is from southern Italy in Decalatura, which is a little tiny village in Calabria, which I've always known. It's a fact. I have really dark brown eyes. My whole family does. I have really dark, at least in the summer, very tan, olive skin. But it's not something I ever claimed as a part of my identity. I was never like, I'm Italian. It was just like, I'm Italian. Like that, I'm Italian and I'm Scottish. It's just something I knew. But as I started reading this book, you get to part 1, and there's this part where it talks about, it opens up with a calabrese proverb, which is, fire is only as good as the wood being burned. Work is only as good as the people who do it. I remember when I heard that, my heart stopped just a little bit, because honestly, that's what my family had been teaching me and ingraining in me since I was little. This value of hard work and et cetera. And throughout the rest of the book, these little parallels just kept showing up. These little details about my family that I just assumed were regular everyday things, all of a sudden were feeling really, really cultural. You know, grandmothers that just continue to give food, and like daughter-in-laws that argue, like, I'm not gonna take the food, and then very impartial son-in-laws who are like, okay, just take the food and leave. You know, that was just a part of my family. That was a part of our life. It was like the stubborn yelling in the kitchen, the obscene amounts of food. It was just something that I never really saw as anything except my life. So then in a couple months, I wound up diving into the language of Italian. I was like, let's try and reconnect. So that was my first step. My first step to reconnecting to my family a little bit was learning Italian. And actually, I was pretty good. I actually admire myself a little bit, I think my younger self, for the amount of ambition that she had, because I worked really hard and I wasn't half bad. But at some point, junior year was looming, and my available time in my life was just really waning. But instead of wholeheartedly giving up, I wound up just shifting gears. So by the time I got to junior year, you're starting to think about college and what you want to do with your life. Originally, I gun-ho went in and I said mechanical engineering, because my dad had been telling me to do it for years. I had a background in welding, and I loved fabrication, so that just makes sense, right? That's easy. But there was this little thing nagging at me, and it was the bottom left corner of my bookshelf in my room, which over the years, for my whole childhood, had been accumulating architecture and design books. These little things, or these books, just, I was sitting there and looking at them, and something had just clicked. My Nonna was a general contractor in the late 20th century, which is quite a feat for a woman. She did everything too. She designed the house, and then she was there on the site until the day the key was passed over. She's incredible, and I could tell you everything about her and her company that built entire neighborhoods in the desert. I could go on, but all in all, she's incredible. She was a force of nature and an incredible inspiration in my life. And so my 16th birthday, she gave me a gift, and it was all of the gifts that she'd saved for almost 50 years. But she also gave me a little gray folder with typed up versions of stories from her life. Thankfully, in the moment, I did realize how incredible that was, and I started sobbing. But what it left me with was this desire for more. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more stories about her life. I wanted to know more stories about her family's life. I just wanted more. For example, I learned that she was accepted into Juilliard, but her grandfather didn't let her go because a young unmarried woman in her 20s and early 60s was just not acceptable, so she didn't go. But I also learned about my great-grandfather, him and all of his brothers came together as the sons of immigrants, and they all got each other through medical school, every single one. They also got their sisters through college. Every single person in that family, like the first generation, every single one educated in the 60s and the 50s. And now, it means, now looking back, I know that my dad, he didn't go through medical school, but he became a researcher for the Cleveland Clinic. He worked incredibly hard. He has a PhD and got himself educated at the highest level he physically possibly could, following his grandfather's legacy. And now he's a researcher at the Cleveland Clinic and one of the best in his field in the world. And so, all to say, these family stories they started to become a little bit of an obsession. I wanted to know more. Because all of a sudden, I found myself traveling. Stuck at home, but I was traveling. And as corny as it sounds, I was traveling instead of the cobblestone streets of Vienna, it was inside myself. I was exploring the meaning of my dark brown eyes and my tan skin and my muscular build and my opinionated voice. And it was an experience. But November 2021, I unfortunately, in my senior year, had to attend the funeral of my great-great-aunts. It was the first time in 2 years that I'd seen the family in any way, really shape or form. And sometimes it was the first time that I met some of them, some of the extended family in my memory. And at this point, in my senior year, I had officially applied for my B.Arch program, so for a Bachelor's of Architecture, a 5-year professional's degree. And it was something that I could proudly walk in and tell them. And the past 3 months had really been this whirlwind of preparation. It had been learning how to become an observational artist, how to write about family and your vulnerabilities, all for the sake of an acceptance letter in 3 months. And in the process of writing and in the process of making this art, I was really having to grapple with what it all meant. And that also included, I had to, in so many ways, shapes, forms, and words, I was just asked, why do you want to be an architect? And after all these 2 years, it was so easy. Because I want to be my Nona for my granddaughter one day. I want to be the woman that she can look to in absolute, and my granddaughter can look to in absolute awe. Because of the force of nature and the continued legacy of building physical and literal communities. So November 2021, all in black, surrounded by family. It was the first time I had seen them in the 2 years after asking questions and deciding what it meant to actually be in Morosco, trying to ask questions and gather as much information. I was amongst all of them. And it was like walking around funhouse mirrors. Like I feel like, there's different proportions and features and sizes and heights, but all in all, it was the same basic model. And so while I was asking questions of them, they asked questions of me. And when the inevitable question comes up, what are you doing next year? And I said I was going to become an architect. Not I'm going to school for, I'm becoming an architect. And in that moment, a lot of their eyes would get a little bit gentle, and they'd squeeze my arm a little bit or my shoulder. And in that moment, I like to think, when everything got a little gentle, that they knew that I wanted to carry on the legacy of my grandmother. That I wanted to carry on her legacy and put her name on a building in a way that she would never have been able to do as a woman in the 70s and the 80s. I wanted to carry on the legacy of my hardworking family by getting educated at the highest level I physically possibly could. I wanted to carry on the legacy of the Morosco name and give it life for a whole other generation. So, all in all, so we got to this point, and I started to carry a physical representation a little bit as a reminder for me. So here on my left hand, I keep a ring that's inscribed with the coordinates of Decolatura, where my family, where it all started, where a branch of the Morosco family is still thriving today. And I keep it as a reminder that we all need to continue reaching back and finding these stories and creating our roots. Because finding these roots and finding this community, it was in that moment that I was sitting there in November where I realized I could never achieve my first dream, which was to sit and speak Italian with my great-great-aunt over coffee in Pizzelle. I was walking her house for the last time without her there. And it was this reminder that I needed to continue asking questions, to never stop wondering, and never stop gathering those connections with my family. But now, as an official member of the class of 2027 in my Dream B.Arch program, I can at least proudly say that I'm very excited to see what the future will hold. And through quarantine, a young nomad was forced to put down a little bit of roots. Would I say today that my roots are here in Cleveland? No. But before they were nowhere. Now my roots lie with the people who taught me the value of hard work, who taught me how to use my voice to be proud of myself and to stand up for what I believe in. My roots are in all of my family heirlooms and the cornicello that I wear around my neck. I'm going to close with a phrase that I've been learning and keeping with me for the past 2 years. And if I butcher the Italian, my apologies, I'm still learning. But grazie per tutto quello che mi ha dato, con gloria lo faccio per la mia famiglia. Thank you for all you have given me. I do it for my family. Thank you. I want to take a nap. Oh, yeah.
Our next and final speaker before our brief intermission is Anna Liu to talk about personal finance, the difference between failure and success.
Shoot, that was, yeah, because I am planning on walking. Raise your hands if you ever lost money. I don't care where you lost it from, what happened, just losing money. Okay, now keep your hands raised if the amount that you lost was more than $100. 200? 500? 1,000? 10,000? 100,000? Okay, well, in the year of 2020, this is not working. In the year of 2020, I managed to lose over $20,000 from trading options. It was during history class. I had no idea what I was doing. You see, I wanted the graph to go like this, but it wound up doing something like that. Now, it's not about how much money that you made or lost. What is about the lessons that you learned from that experience? And I learned a ton of lessons from losing over $20,000 during history class while I was supposed to be reading a passage about imperialism in the 19th century. Some of these lessons included, not YOLOing my entire portfolio into random options contracts, being more smarter and more structured with my investing, and doing my research, and actually knowing what I was doing and having a good strategy. It was through these strategies and all of this hard work and dedication that I was able to make back this $20,000 loss and then some. Now, I will acknowledge that I had a lot of benefits when it came to making back this $20,000 loss. First of all, being a kid, I didn't have to pay the bills. I didn't have to worry about paying my rent or mortgage. I didn't have to make my car payments. I didn't have to worry about student debt or paying my tuition. Instead, it was just me, my remaining 10 grand, and my very angry parents. Now, what if you were an adult and you were trying to make back this $20,000 loss or a significant amount of debt? All the money that you'd make would first have to go towards paying off your basic needs, such as having food, clothes, a place to live, etc. After all, you can't really make money if you're dead. Now, what are some ways to prevent this? Well, we can not die, and we can also have better finance skills. But here's where the problem lies. You see, in a study conducted by George Washington University, 1,043 adults were asked 28 questions about personal finance on topics such as personal investing, making money, saving your money, etc. Now, of these US adults, about half, it was split 50-50 between those who answered half of the questions correctly and those who didn't. 20% of them answered less than a quarter of the questions correctly, and only 16% answered and had a high level of financial literacy. And what about kids? Well, of all 50 US states, only 3 of them require personal finance to be taught in schools. And more than half of them, a total of 29 states, have no requirements whatsoever for teaching personal finance. And this is a huge problem, because how are you supposed to be able to do this and make sense of all of that when you've never seen or done anything about it beforehand? I mean, look at it. It's confusing and overwhelming. I mean, I can't really make sense of it either. If you can't go through all of this, and if you're not exposed to these
expenses and are not able to keep track of all these beforehand, how are you supposed to be able to do them when you're older, when you're 18 and thrown into the real world, having to do all of this? After all, when you take a test, you want to study for it beforehand. When you do anything, you want to prepare for it. Before you pay your taxes and your bills, you want to know how to do them and what they're for and why you have to pay them, of course. And same with investing. Before you invest, you want to know how to invest, where to invest your money, what are the best ways and places to do so. Same goes with finance. And it's shocking that so many schools and there are not enough information being taught about this issue. Now, with an increasing number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits, it is more and more important to have a solid knowledge of financial education. And it is also more and more important to have multiple finance sources so that in case the pandemic happens or you lose your job, you're not thrown into debt and thrown into severe drawbacks. In 2020 alone, nearly 50% of Americans had trouble paying their rent, their mortgage, and their bills. Learning finance and financial education at a young age can help prevent these from happening. Looking at this graph, you can see a lot of Americans had problems with these bills, and the majority of them had to borrow money from their friends and family, and to pull money from their savings and retirements in order to make ends meet. If we can learn finance at a young age, we can prevent a lot of these from happening. You can fix problems before they happen, and by learning investing at a young age, you can avoid financial mistakes and pitfalls that will hinder you in your later life. After all, nobody wants to lose $20,000 during history class. Thank you.
Okay. pronounce your last name as Lou? Okay. Is it? Hi, I wanted to make an announcement that we're going to start at 12:05, so if everyone could be in their seats by then, that would be great. Thank you. Just to confirm, your title is Finding One's Way. Okay. You go to Beechwood? Okay. Guess it probably shouldn't use clicker. Yeah, it's like it works, and I just wanted to. I might just do it clicking myself. Is there any? Should I just be that one side the whole time, or? Yeah. Okay, so once you walk on, I can just click it on? Okay. And then Bradley's gonna put the mic.
So here's the microphone, and then
Where do I put it?
you can clip this onto like your lapel or. Wait, yeah, maybe try like. What about like on the lapel,
Like, okay.
or maybe try it on the other side. Oh, yeah, no. Alright, and then you can put
Pocket.
this. Yeah, you put it that way. Alright, and you or yeah, I guess that's fine. Is there like, can you hide it like, I don't know, or in your back pocket? Or yeah, that's actually.
If you have pockets as well, you can put it in there.
There you go.
Okay,
Alright.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna, actually I shouldn't.
But can I just,
Brad, can
I
you
gotta make,
click? Okay.
is there a green light and number?
Okay.
Yep.
She only has one slide.
One slide?
So once she walks on, can you click it on and make sure that's,
Which one? This arrow?
yeah, that arrow when it starts, so you're good? Okay, I'm gonna make an announcement, and then when I walk back, you can walk on.
Why do you have the name tag like for that?
No.
The mic is currently on.
What?
The mics are on. I don't know.
All right, welcome back. Now to start us off with the second half of TEDx Youth at University School is Elizabeth Liu to talk about finding one's way in a time of gray.
Good afternoon. I'm sure we've all heard this statement to look on the bright side at one point or another in our lives. It's a pretty common statement, so if you haven't heard it, where have you been living? You know, you got in a car accident? Well, look on the bright side. Yeah, from that example, you can probably tell that there's a bit of a problem with this statement, which is that it doesn't exactly explain how you can find the bright side because when you can't see it, because maybe it's just impossible to see at a given moment. And what do you do when that bright side is absent for days, weeks, months, or maybe even years? What are you to do then? I'm sure that you would all agree that 2020 kind of sucked. I mean, are you really going to argue with that statement? It's practically a fact. For me personally, it was definitely a time where I could not find the bright side. I was unable to be optimistic when I could find nothing to be optimistic about. I drifted through the year feeling as if everything that I experienced was in colorless monochrome. I lost my passion for basically everything. I lost my motivation, and I had no idea or will to do anything with my practically unlimited time. Of course, eventually, schools opened up and I was finally released from an era of being stuck at home all the time, which was good, yay. But after a while of liveliness and a rehabilitation of excitement, I fell back into old habits. I thought that going back to school and finally getting out of the house and being with my friends would make me happy again, bring back the bright side that had been absent from my life for so long. But in actuality, my mental state stayed the same. I was stuck in the depression of the past year, and reflecting this, my behavior also stayed the same. But unlike the past year, in which I was in middle school and everything was super easy, I actually received the consequences for these actions, which was seen very starkly when my grades started tanking. This sudden reveal of the consequences made me realize something that I had been blind to for so long. It made me think to myself, wake up, Elizabeth. Life is moving on without you. And it truly was. This was a self-realization that I needed to have, as it caused me to actually pay attention to my own actions instead of blaming everything on the outside forces in my life, which was COVID. But this wasn't just an epiphany either. I didn't just wake up one morning and finally realize everything that I was missing all along. That wasn't what happened. I had to grapple with the fact that I had wasted a year of my life. That's time that I'm never going to get back again. But I needed to move on from these regrets in order to move on with life. So in order to move on, I had to make two realizations. The first one was that I needed to realize that my grades weren't the most important thing that mattered. I know that society and society's people definitely put a huge, huge weight on your grades as basically a deciding factor of your future and a determination of your worth. And that's a whole other issue that I don't want to get into at this moment, but personally for me, the state of my grades were basically a reflection of the state of my self-esteem at that time. And that was pretty horrible for my mental health. So that was my first realization. And finally, this made me realize that I needed to stop laser focusing on that one thing. So my second realization was that I needed to figure out my priorities and figure out what was important to me. This may sound vague, but I basically just had to sort out my mind instead of just leaving it the jumbled mess that it had been for even longer than the pandemic had started. I started being present inside of my own life. I stopped being compliant with my previously lethargic way of living, and I pushed against the tempting pull of giving up. After the semester closed, I look back and I see how hard I worked and how well I persevered, but yet I still couldn't see the bright side. The weight and the regret of wasting that year was dragging me back. And even though that chapter of my life was over, it was still weighing upon my shoulders. And I could still feel the fear of regression inside of my soul. So I look back at the past year, and I know that I definitely did not use my time wisely. But was it really truly wasted? That working towards the future and improving myself helped me realize some things that I had been missing all along. So I don't believe that that year was completely wasted. In actuality, it helped me. So I forgave myself. But I'm not just saying that I forgave and forgot. I forgave and remembered. Now I look at the present and I see the positive side of being in that darkness. I've gained that experience, that priceless experience of going through that sort of hard time, possibly one of the hardest times of my lifetime. And why is this experience so priceless, you ask? Well, it's because now, moving forward, in the back of my head, I'll always be able to know that I have the ability to make it. I have the capability to make it through that kind of hard time. And what I've learned from the dawn of the 2020s is that you might not always see the bright side immediately. The darkness may last for days, weeks, months, or even years. But what I've learned is this: when everything calms down and you take a step back and reflect upon your experience, you'll be able to see the bright side that was absent before. Thank you.
Our seventh speaker is Reza Koreshi from University School to give his speech, Unleashing My Inner Artist.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited to speak to you guys today about 2020. Unfortunately, you can't think about 2020 without mentioning COVID-19. While there were very many losses, there were also very many gains. And today, I'm going to talk to you about my personal gains of unleashing my inner artist. So as you can see in this picture, it's about 2010. I'm 4 or 5 years old. I look a little bratty, spoiled, entitled. So my mom felt the need to put us in an art program to help shape us as better people. Unfortunately, one day at work, my mom received the worst news that broke her heart. We were very disruptive kids. Essentially, this email wrote that Reza Koreshi's behavior continues to be disruptive and problematic and diminishes the quality of Arts for Kids movement session for the other students. If you want to read the intricacies, by all means, go ahead. But at the end, she said that I believe Reza would excel in an after-school sports program rather than an arts program. If we circle back to 2020 again, we can think about that when we got out of school that day, we saw it as a plus. We saw it as, we will not have to go to school for 2 more weeks. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be fun. However, sports started getting canceled. Restaurants started getting closed. You couldn't see your friends. Life got very boring. We needed something to do. The only thing to do was projects. We needed to do art. Personally, while you may see that art means conventionally painting, music making, playing an instrument, I define art as specific projects or activities one does that can be built upon to overall help improve one's personality and promote change to oneself. As you've heard, the brain is divided into 2 main parts. The left side, which is the logical part, talking about math and calculations, and the right side, which is creativity. All my life, I have been a logic person. I've always been this left side of the brain. COVID opened up an opportunity for me to develop my right side of my brain and develop my creativity. The first time, or the project that I developed, was music. My brother Zach is a fantastic producer, rapper, plays piano, and one day he asked me if I wanted to join on a song. As his biggest critic, I obliged, and I helped him, and I never knew I could rap, but when I was on that song, I proved to be a success. I went on his first album on Spotify, and it was one of the most successful songs on that album. The second project that I took up was cooking. Anybody who knows me knows that I love food. I not only love how it tastes, I love how it looks, the effort put into food. So when my parents were working long hours and we had great religious restrictions and food places were closed, I had to take it upon myself to start making my own food for not only myself, but my family as well. I used TikTok, I used YouTube, I used things to make these recipes. These included my famous nachos at home with the side of guacamole, and let me tell you, you would not hate it. And second, this pizza with the homemade dough from the dough kneader. It's fantastic. I not only classify art as a project, but appreciating art as an art as well. Golf allowed me to do that. I was able to love the nature to the fullest extent while I was able to play golf every single day. I was able to play with my brothers, play outside. I could really love nature while playing for several hours a day. I loved golf so much that it served as an inspiration for my entrepreneurship class in my pitch project and pitch deck project, Signal Ball, which was essentially going to be the first GPS golf ball in the market. The next project that I took up was do-it-yourself projects. Oftentimes, when I was younger, when our house was being built, I watched these builders and I loved what they were doing. I was fascinated by the stuff that they were doing. In fact, in 8th grade, in woodshop, I even made my own house with these small wooden sticks. And having COVID there, being bored, made me reintroduce this topic. I went in my closet and saw my 100 hats there, and I was like, I gotta do something with this. I had a blank wall behind my video game setup, and I was like, let me go on Amazon, let me see what they have. So I went on Amazon, I found these plastic holders, and then I made my way to Home Depot. I was able to get a leveler, a measuring tape, a drill, and do all that stuff, and I was able to accomplish this. Additionally, as summer was coming along, the baseball season was in store. And I essentially wanted to work on my baseball practice and wanted to learn how to pitch better, so I decided to build my own pitching mound. I came up with the calculations, started drilling, and eventually bought the turf and bought the rubber, and I came out with the product that was very useful and that I loved. But the best part about doing projects yourself is not the outcome itself, but it's the success that comes with it, because you endure failures. Then you have to reconvene to that process and try again, and then you get that success. The feeling of success is so much better when you don't succeed the first time. Back in 6th grade, I became familiar with an early topic that had not been so popular at the time, which is fidget spinners. I took it upon myself, I used a friend's gift card, and I bought 25 fidget spinners. I went in the school bathroom and I sold them for profit, of course. Well, unfortunately, I got in trouble because, I was doing it in the school bathroom. It made me learn how I could start selling products. And this leads me to my final important topic here, which is shoe customization. This is one of my favorite personal topics because I not only love doing the products and love what the outcomes are, but I was able to sell these to people not only in my country, but overseas too, and at sneaker conventions as well, to people who I've never even met that showed an interest in my art skills. These are some of my examples that I was able to make. This is a picture of my studio that I do my art in. This is meant to show you that I started all of this from nothing. I started this from watching YouTube, watching people do this, and I was like, okay, I have the diligence to do this too. Let me see what I can do. I bought the paints, I bought the brushes, I bought the shoes, I bought the shoe trees, I bought the stencil machine, and I was able to successfully do it even though there were failures within that success. Overall, through this COVID time, there are two main takeaways. One is that if you go through every single art project and topic that I just discussed, you will notice one common thing. I did every single subject with a family member, whether it was cooking with my mother or golfing with my siblings. This was a great time for bonding skills. This is not only the time when I had overtime with my family, everybody had this opportunity. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that will come to us, and we took it to advantage. we bonded with our family more than ever. And second is that in these processes of expertise, I was able to do research. Then I had fails. And I was able to come back with the new things I learned in order to make success. Overall, in 2020, I was able to grow mentally and emotionally. So now if we reconvene to this letter, I think it's safe to tell Dr. Rooney that she was wrong. Thank you.
Next up is Shimari Brazil from Laurel's High School to explain how to help students survive school.
Is quiet and attentive is what my teachers would write in comments and would tell my mom in parent-teacher conferences. My years up through 8th grade were feeding a desire to be that perfect student that I so-called was. I wanted to get straight A's and be the best, and not to brag, but I achieved it for the most part. But after 8th grade, that drive just stopped. When I entered freshman year, that was the same year I was diagnosed with cancer, 2018. During treatment and harder classes, I started my own journey with mental health. Prolonged hospital stays combined with social stress of missing school for 9 months and missing out on key high school events that all my friends got to go to created feelings of depression and anxiety. I remember that when I got these, I thought that they made me weak. And I was ashamed that I had these feelings. I should be able to control this. And looking back on it, that was a pretty stupid thought. But I still wanted to be that perfect student. So I just wanted to be the student that could focus in class, the student that could do her work on time, and the student who knew how to study. But instead, I was absolutely none of those things. I was the student that played games in class instead of listening, the student who didn't know how to study and winged every single test that was given to her, and the student that had no clue how to manage her time. If you ask any of my teachers from high school if I turned in an assignment on time, I promise you that they would all say no. So I was a little concerned, and I thought that maybe I was alone in this. But after doing some research, I realized that I wasn't alone. In fact, according to the National Alliance on Mental Health, 17% of children between the ages of 6 and 17 have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Now, I emphasize diagnosis because a diagnosis is a privilege that not many people get to have. So in reality, that number is much higher. But what stood out the most to me is that I was ashamed. I remember that I didn't even want to get help until my mother and my oncologist pushed me to get it because they thought it would counteract the physically presenting symptoms like nausea, shortness of breath, shakiness, racing pulse. And so I did. But I wanted to know if other people felt the same way. And I'm going to pose a question now. Where do you think these symptoms presented themselves the most? And if you thought school, you were right. You were very, very right. I don't know if it was the academics or school or the social stress of it or fear of the future, but school caused a lot of panic attacks and breakdowns. And so I was curious, was I the only person that school made them feel like this? So I did a little bit of research. According to activeminds.org, 80% of high school students feel some sort of anxiety about school. 80%. When a number is that high, maybe it's time that we could reconsider that it's the students' fault that they're so anxious. Maybe it's time we reevaluate the school system, and maybe it's time we try and fix that. So I tried to put these statistics into perspective. I talked to friends and classmates, and I asked them, does school make you anxious? Yes. That was the only answer I got, was yes. School makes almost everybody in my school anxious. And so then I elaborated and I asked, well, what about school makes you anxious? What is it exactly that causes these deep feelings of anxiety? And they gave me one of three answers. 1, cold calling, 2, participation grades, and 3, assigned groups. Now, to most teachers, these might seem like mundane and normal classroom things that are just part of learning. But to students, these things can be the difference between comfort and discomfort in the classroom. So now I will share with you what my friends and I came up with as a way to counteract these. Number 1, cold calling. If you don't know, cold calling is when a teacher calls on a student that isn't raising their hand. And instead of putting the student on the spot and expecting them to know the answer, the student usually gets the answer wrong. And it's not because they don't know the answer, but it's because they're just put on the spot and they haven't had time to think of an answer, or they're too nervous to answer and their mind goes blank. And even worse, sometimes it even causes spiraling what-if questions, like, what if I'm dumb? What if all my classmates think I'm dumb? What if my teacher thinks I'm dumb? What if I'm gonna fail out of school and work at McDonald's forever? Something like that. But what I realized is that there's an easy solution to this. Don't cold call people. Instead, call on students that are raising their hand, because oftentimes those students could be having a better day, or those students are more confident in their answer and have a detailed explanation to give. Next is participation grades. And I know this one might be a little controversial to teachers who might teach more conservatively and enjoy grading someone based off of their participation in class. But participation grades don't accurately measure someone's knowledge in the class. Instead, they measure someone's confidence in the class and their ability to spit out knowledge. But I think that if a student can show that they know everything on paper or in private, then their participation grade should count little or not at all. And last is assigned groups. Last year I took a class, and I loved this class, but when we did group projects, we would be with juniors and seniors because this class was a mixed level class. So we would get assigned juniors with seniors, seniors with juniors, stuff like that. And I realized that I got really, really nervous around the seniors. And honestly, I think I was a little afraid of them, but that's not something we're gonna get into right now. But I noticed that when I was assigned to work with seniors, I would get really anxious. And it would be hard for me to communicate with them, and I would be afraid to talk to them, and usually I ended up overcompensating and doing extra work because I felt like I wasn't doing enough, or I didn't know what they were gonna be doing on the project. But later in the year, we shifted, and I was allowed to work with my friends. It was juniors with juniors, seniors with seniors, and this seemed to go much better. I could talk to my friends, and my friends, we could all design a project that we loved, and we could communicate, and I could be like, hey, can you do this part? I'll do this part, and it went great. And we had more fun making it, and it just made the experience overall more enjoyable. And I ended up getting better grades leads to less anxiety, and it just creates a positive cycle. So, in conclusion, I noticed that the classes that don't cold call, the classes that don't have assigned groups, and the classes that don't have participation grades, I ended up being happier in, and I ended up doing much better in those classes too. And it wasn't just me, but also all the other people in those classes. I talked to my friends, and they all said the same thing, that classes that didn't do those three things, everyone just had more fun and enjoyed learning in that class. So, I'm gonna end it off here, but with a little tip. The next time you see a group of teenagers or high school students, take a little bit of pity on them. Not because they're teenagers, but instead because they're going through high school and they're probably gonna be really, really stressed, either about school, about the social aspect of school, about the future, about things like that. So if you see someone struggling in school, maybe go over and ask them, hey, are you okay? Because it can be really, really hard to ask for help. So give them that little push, because that little push can be the difference between someone's happiness in the classroom and discomfort in the classroom. Thank you.
Next is Olivia Boyer from Hathaway Brown High School to talk about the relationship between Afghanistan and the media. Explained.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming today. It is truly an honor to be here. So to start off and tell you just a little bit about my project and to tell you about me in comparison to it is I have always wanted to be a broadcast journalist, an international correspondent to be exact. And my dream is to be like the woman on the screen, or who will be in a moment, Clarissa Ward. She's my personal idol. And why she's so significant in the case of Afghanistan and when talking about its relationship to the media is that she is the Western media's scope into Afghanistan. She is a white woman who travels and interviews different terrorist groups such as Boko Haram, the Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. And she gives an international view and specifically a Western scope of what they're doing there. But another thing that's important to mention when talking why this relates to me specifically is that as a half-white, half-Pakistani American, it's important to me that we understand this region fully when it comes to our personal bias from the Western perspective. So the best way I could think of presenting this to you is by looking at the headlines and looking at the facts. So in just a moment when it comes up, an important thing to note is that Western media has a silly little habit of only covering things when it pertains to us. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, we talk about the news when it pertains to us, when it pertains to our troops, when it pertains to what we have to do with the country. And this is shown, these are the headlines from August 30th, 2021. Now, notice these headlines all have to do with Kabul, but there are some buzzwords in these notes that actually point out how it relates to us and how it relates to the West. Notice, in the first one, it's Afghans as the US military departs. It's what will happen to me, Afghans who fled to different countries. Biden, our president, observes a return of troops during Kabul bombing, and the US conducts a drone strike in Kabul and winds down as deadline nears. Now notice these buzzwords trigger the Western perspective to think about ourselves in relation to Kabul, in relation to Afghanistan, yet again, instead of simply what's going on in the country. Now to note a little bit about our short attention span when it comes to regions like this, here are the headlines from September 10th, 11 days later, and notice, we still have one headline about Kabul, but the flight that left that day was actually going to the United States. And it's important to note in these headlines, Kabul is mentioned, but there are specific notes such as Alaska's Bristol Bay, Biden and the vaccines, Russia and Belarus, but all the other headlines, along with the one about Kabul, have to do with the West and the Western perspective. Now, this is what happens only 10 days later when we notice that even though things in Afghanistan were still going wrong and things were horrible, there were bombings, natural disasters, people are homeless, starving, we're not focusing on it anymore. Our attention span is gone once our people are gone. Now, for those of you who are competitive, feel free to time me. I'm going to give you a 90-second history on one of the most complex regions in the world spanning 55 plus years. So let's start off in 1979 when the Soviet Union attempted to take over Afghanistan. But throughout the 1980s, the US fought a proxy war against the Soviet Union by backing the Mujahideen, which is another rival terrorist group in Afghanistan. In 1989, the Soviet Union had given up. And by 1992, the Afghan communists fell. Now, between 1989 and 1992 was the Afghan Civil War, which was the Mujahideen against the Taliban fighting over land and causing mass destruction in Afghanistan itself. Then, by 1996, the Taliban took over Kabul for the very first time, and on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. Just for your information, Al-Qaeda is a Taliban offshoot group, so it's important to note that when thinking about this. On December 17, 2001, the US entered Afghanistan for the first time, starting America's longest war. Now in 2003, the US and UN westernized the Afghani government. In 2004, the Taliban regrouped in Pakistan, which was actually funded by the Pakistani government to keep them up and protect them from the Mujahideen. 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed. In 2019, Trump started talks with the Taliban about US withdrawal, all the way to August 2020, 2021, where we actually ended up leaving Afghanistan. Now, when we look at this timeline, there's important, since we have a little extra time, there are a couple important things to note. Now, the first thing is where US funding comes in when talking about Afghanistan and the troubles in their government there. Before the Afghani Civil War, we had funded the Taliban to fight the Mujahideen, again, to protect them from the Soviets. And then after that, we kind of created our own monster and paid the Mujahideen to fight the Taliban, and so on. We had also funded Osama bin Laden's personal family several times throughout history, as long as the Taliban itself. Also, one more important thing to note is that many of the low-ranking officials in the 1996 takeover are high-ranking officials in 2021. So that just goes to exemplify how terrorist groups, much of their biggest successes and biggest positive trait is that they're patient, which is why they can be so dangerous in the Western perspective and in any perspective. Now, let's play a little game of word association. Here, in a moment, are some pictures here are some pictures that I looked up on Wikimedia, which is a copyright-free resource, and important to note that I didn't look up Afghani troops, Afghani war, I simply put in the word Afghanistan. Now, what I see in these pictures are troops, men, Western perspective, danger, terrorism, war, but I also see maybe 5 Afghani people in the top left corner. This just goes to show that although this is an international website that anyone in the world has access to, it's not affiliated with a specific country, the Western perspective overhails that and shows only one side of the story. Now, this is one story. And when we focus on one perspective rather than the whole, we lose the humanity that the country actually has. Now, let's play word association round 2. These are pictures from the 1996 Kabul takeover from the Taliban. And what do we see? I see influence, power, danger, evil, men, Islamophobia, all of that. But the thing is, although it is broadened from the previous photos, this is not necessarily a better representation. It's also, I found it extremely interesting to note that all of these photos, except for one, are from news resources. Whether Middle Eastern or Western, all of them are from the news except for one, the one of the aircraft carrier dropping bombs on Afghanistan. Now, this is important to note because that shows us our governmental resources. That shows us where our government's heads are at, and thus where our heads land. Now, word association round 3. These are pictures from the Kabul 2021 takeover. Now, note there are still these traces of war, power, Westernism, all of those things. But what we also notice is that there's a lot more humanity. You see the effects of this. Okay. You see the effects of what they've done on Afghanistan. You see people crying, the famous picture throwing the baby over the wall, people stuck in airports trying to get out. You see perspective. You see more than one story. And that is where we're improving. When you see more than one perspective, you see the reality, and it gives you the humanity of the people who are actually involved. And by giving them the humanity, we give them respect. Now, in this, Phil Grimm, who was a co-founder of the Washington Post, said that news is the first rough draft of history. I feel better about this rough draft. I don't know if you do, and I can't say for sure. But what we have to notice is to be an effective portrayer of history, we have to see both sides. We have to weigh the scales, and we have to land even-handed. And hopefully, we're heading in that direction. So while things haven't gotten completely better and things are still pretty bad in Afghanistan, hopefully this just opens the scope and continues. Thank you.
Our 10th and final speaker of the day is Bryce Hodge from University School to give a speech, 15 minutes.
Yeah. Since its founding, the United States has preached that it is the land of equal opportunity. But throughout history, the country has consistently shown us that this is not the case. Slavery. The implementation of Jim Crow laws and the treatment of Muslim Americans post 9/11 offer prominent examples of widespread discrimination in this country's past. But the most relevant and critical case of discrimination today is the growing issue of education inequality. There are many sources of inequality in education, but near the root of the problem in Ohio is that the state funds public schools through property taxes. But this isn't a new problem. In 1996, in the landmark case, DeRolf versus Ohio, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the state's system for funding public schools was unconstitutional as the state failed to provide a thorough and efficient education system by relying so heavily upon property taxes to fund schools. The error in this system is that school districts with high property values can much more easily meet the needs of and provide more opportunities for their students, while students in poorer areas suffer. While this system was declared unconstitutional, the legislature has failed to offer a viable alternative. 30 years later, this unconstitutional system still stands. The error in this system is that, this flaw in Ohio's education system means that the quality of education of two students separated by a 15-minute drive can be quite different. You can see this problem in Northeast Ohio, where students in Solon, the niche-ranked 5th best school in Ohio, go to school 15 minutes away from students in Bedford, the niche-ranked 733rd best school in Ohio. But rankings aside, the differences in these schools are represented through the performance of their students. For example, 96% of students at Solon scored at or above proficient in math, while only 28% of students in Bedford accomplished the same feat. Moreover, students at Solon averaged a 1330 SAT and a 29 ACT, while students at Bedford averaged a 1060 SAT and a 21 ACT. In short, the disparities in these schools are very apparent, and this problem is happening all across the country. All across the country. Now, the disparities in education equality, or actually, the problem of education equality dates back to the beginning of our country's history. But the gaps in high-quality education have greatly expanded due to the pandemic. The first example of this is the lack of access to technology in low-income areas. Even before the outbreak, students who had access to education had an upper hand on their peers who didn't. But during and after the pandemic, technology was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. But this wasn't a problem for schools who had the resources to give their students laptops or computers to continue their classes. On the other hand, schools who didn't struggled to find ways to teach effective lessons to their students. That was just one problem emphasized by the pandemic. Another often overlooked imbalance is access to Wi-Fi. In this country, Wi-Fi is often overlooked, in this country, access to Wi-Fi is often Thank you. It's just the slide's not working. Here, go back. In this country, access to Wi-Fi is often taken for granted. We come home, we watch Netflix on our TV, send emails on our computers, and scroll through Twitter on our phones. However, families that weren't able to afford Wi-Fi weren't able to work from home, they weren't able to log into their classes, and they weren't able to complete their assignments. But going to school in 2020 was still difficult for students who were blessed enough to have the opportunity or to have access to computers and capable Wi-Fi. Without the structure of sitting in class with the teacher, and with parents who weren't always overly concerned with their child's attentiveness to class, many kids simply chose not to log in. And if they did, they weren't paying attention. But this shouldn't be shocking. If you give a third grader the choice to play Xbox in the background or listen to their teacher on Zoom, it's not hard to guess what they would choose. Many parents didn't even realize that there was a problem until it was too late. I mean, if you're a parent working 2 to 3 jobs to keep food on the table, it's difficult to micromanage if your kids are engaged. These are just a few of the many issues highlighted by the pandemic. We can't go back in time and change how we reacted to that drastic change in our life. Instead, we must begin to think about how we will bounce back from that dreadful year. But recovering from the educational losses of the pandemic will undoubtedly be a challenge in itself, as students whose parents can't afford tutors will struggle to catch up. But these problems aren't simply a financial issue. They are disproportionately affecting minorities. Data shows that Black and Hispanic households with school-aged children were 1.5 more times as likely as white ones to face limited access to computers and the internet, and more than 2 in 5 low-income households only had limited access. These disparities could have long-term implications given that young students of color are much more likely to live in remote-only districts. All in all, the most frustrating part of the education inequality and the pandemic is that there is no clear way to solve these issues. Fortunately, almost everyone in the room will vote in next year's election, and all of us will eventually have the opportunity to choose our representatives on the state and federal level. As you think about this responsibility, I would encourage you to consider how often you've heard a candidate for office ask how he or she intends to address the unconstitutional system for funding public schools. How many attack ads have you seen? How many headlines about candidate plans? Sadly, the answer is none. If we are serious about addressing this most basic area of equality of opportunity, this must change. Ultimately, we must answer the question of whether we are willing to demand our public officials address real policy. This is hard work, but if we do not engage in this work, who will? We, as people who are blessed enough to receive high-quality education, must understand the responsibility we have to demand more for those who didn't have the same privilege. If we do believe in the promise of America, if we believe that fundamental to that promise is the equality of opportunity, and if we believe in the American dream, why not start by ensuring our communities provide a thorough and efficient education for every young person? Thank you and good morning.
I wanted to thank you all again for coming to experience this great culmination of hard work known as TEDx Youth at University School. A special thanks to the TEDx Youth at University School team and tech team, as well as the chaperones and everyone else who participated in making this event a reality. Most of all, thank you to all of the speakers. Now, as we exit the building, feel free to stay another 10 to 15 minutes to talk, ask questions, and congratulate today's speakers on their amazing talks. All recordings will be posted on TEDx Youth at University School YouTube channel and then the TEDx YouTube channel. Thank you again.